Ladies and gentlemen, this Red Gaming Set.com video, we're going to be further discussing ESRAM. And this was prompted because a couple of viewers were pointing me in the direction of a recent interview conducted with Oxide Games, and they were actually speaking about the advantages of embedded RAM. And so viewers were basically asking, what are my thoughts on this and does it translate to the Xbox One? I've done an article on this as well, and it's got all the links to relevant sources because there are a couple of them that I'm going to be speaking about on this. I'm going to be fit for an asylum if I'm doing any other way. So you guys can check the article out, and it's got all the relevant links to bits and bobs with all of the correct graphs and so on. Anyway, so the interview was fairly short. So I'm going to read it out to you to begin with to give us some groundwork. We can say that there are pros and cons of having embedded RAM in general. The primary limiting factor of an embedded GPU on a CPU is certainly going to be bandwidth. On the PC side, the memory bandwidth to the GPU is going to be a limiting factor in most cases of a typical PC with DDR3 memory. In fact, on certain Haswell configurations, Intel has added 128 megabytes of embedded RAM for exactly that reason. For certain operations, this can be a massive speed up. On the negative side, it is always more work to use configurations where there are different memory banks with different speeds, and sometimes it's not always possible to fit your data assets into them. This is what Dan Baker from Oxide Games said. So this begs the question, exactly what is going on? I mean, what are they talking about, as they would say? Well, pretty much, let's break this down. Now, the PC has a version of Intel's latest CPUs known as Haswell, which have an IGP, which is basically an integrated graphics processor, part of the main CPU. Now, this is pretty much for cost-saving measures. In other words, let's say you're owning a laptop. To reduce power consumption and to do general day-to-day work and to basically make the laptop cheaper, rather than having like a high-end, say, NVIDIA card or whatever in there, Intel basically provides their own solution. Now, to power the graphics, they use embedded memory, which is 128 megabytes of embedded RAM. Now, why 128 megabytes? Well, Intel, and this is the quote, Intel doubled the size to deal with any increases in games complexity. So that's 32 megabytes to 64 because they believed that 32 megabytes of EDRAM, not ESRAM, EDRAM was enough, and then they doubled it. So that now, of course, makes it 64 megabytes, and then they doubled it again to make certain. And so Tom Piazza, who works from Intel, said, and I quote, "Go big or go home." This is why they chose 128 megabytes. Now, for your FYI, for your information, this means that the Intel Iris Pro 5200, which is part of some of these Intel Core configurations, actually has a memory bandwidth of 50 gigabytes per second with the EDRAM plus 25.6. So, oh, by the way, the 50 gigabytes per second of the EDRAM is bi-directional, so it's not as fast as the ESRAM. But, of course, we need some level of aim, or something to aim for, shall I say. So, what does this actually mean? Well, in the case of a PC, games aren't specifically encoded to run with such a limited amount of small amount of memory. Or should I say, it's pretty tiny. 128 megabytes compared to a couple of gigs of memory on a modern day GPU is just not that much. So what happens is, and these were some tests conducted by Anantech, once again I've got links here so you can check those out, and they basically did a graph demonstrating the differences in speed between integrated GPUs, in this case the Haswell IGP, and different DDR3 memory speeds, and the results weren't exactly pretty for the DDR3. There was obviously quite a lot of correlation between faster memory speeds, DDR3, than what there were slower DDR3. So in other words, slower DDR3 equals lower frame rate because, quite simply put, the GPU wasn't being fed. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about the PC. So, of course, despite the fact that there are some similarities between the PC and the Xbox One, they are two different beasts in reality. But this does give a great indication of what some of the developers are stating that they're having problems with. And it really comes down to optimization. So, the ESRAM of the Xbox One, from my research, is probably not going to be a problem. In other words, they most likely won't saturate, for most operations, the ESRAM's memory bandwidth. It's just going to be fine. What they will do is they'll use all of the all the space available. So in effect, it's not like they don't actually have enough bandwidth, they don't actually have the space. On the other hand, the DDR3 memory is the complete reverse. They're probably going to get situations eventually, of course, where they're going to fill up the main system RAM. Obviously, not all 8 GB is usable for, well, games. But even so, there's about 5.5 gigs that's available for games. But for most of the part, it probably won't be that's the issue. It's actually going to be the memory bandwidth. And so what's going to happen is you're going to have situations where you've got to be very careful what's actually inside the ESRAM, and then you've got to be very careful, very frugal with what you're doing with the DDR3, and then you've got to somehow match those. Now, on the Xbox One, it supports what is known as tiled resources. Now, to put that into perspective, this means that 16 megabytes of textures, just for example, can access a virtual pool of memory which can be gigabytes in size. So the problem is, however, there's a couple of problems. One, this requires programming techniques. Now, that's not to say that you can't do it. And by the way, OpenGL and Mantle and other versions of this also can do variants of virtual texturing. It's just for the PlayStation 4 it probably won't be a big deal because all the memory is fast on the PS4. So the problem is, first of all, it's going to require programming and for game developers to actually understand it. The second issue with this is that memory bandwidth is also not going to be just used for example, texturing and so on. It's also going to be used for things such as the frame buffer, which of course is utilized to store the image prior to it being displayed on screen. Obviously simplified, but still. So what does that actually mean? Well, I'm sure many of you have heard of the rumors from Call of Duty Ghosts back when it was being developed on the Xbox One and the PS4. Supposedly, the rumours went with COD Ghost that it took actually 3 weeks on the PS4 to get running, whereas it took them something like 3 or 4 months on the Xbox One, and they were only getting like 15 frames per second without optimization. So with optimization, obviously the frame rate went up quite substantially. So what is possible is that without optimization, in other words, without developers utilizing the memory bandwidth efficiently of the DDR3, and without actually understanding where on what to store in the ESRAM, you're going to have problems. So once again, I don't necessarily think that there's a direct cause and effect between PC and Xbox One. I don't really think that sometimes you can mesh them together in this, okay, well, one equals the other. However, I'm still not exactly convinced by Microsoft's decision with the ESRAM. My feeling is that it's going to be a bit too small for a lot of operations. I guess we're just going to have to see what happens. The one benefit, I suppose, and I use benefit in a very loose sense, is because the GPU isn't super powerful anyway. One of the benefits is that it actually doesn't need as much memory bandwidth as, say, the PS4's GPU, simply because, in layman's terms, it doesn't need as much data because it can't process as much data. Think of it like this, if you're still not exactly sure what I'm talking about. Think of it as you're on a conveyor belt. That's a pretty good, easy example. And let's say that there are 2 people at the beginning of the conveyor belt, and let's say there are 2 people at the end of the conveyor belt, and let's say you have this ratio where 2 people are putting boxes on the conveyor belt and another 2 people at the end are taking those boxes and putting them into separate vans. So 2 boxes on, 2 boxes off, 1 into each van. Simple, right? But imagine if the Xbox One, and this is not an accurate analogy, but it's a good visual analogy. Let's assume with the Xbox One that in this case the people putting the boxes on the conveyor belt are the memory bandwidth, and the people putting them into the vans are the processors, if you will. So let's assume that you had this situation where there was only one person able to put boxes in a van. There was only one. Say the other guy is off sick. Okay, but there's still 2 people putting the boxes on the conveyor belt. What happens? Well, it doesn't matter. He can't go any faster than what he's already going, so it's not really going to make that much difference. Sure, if the van maybe gets a little bit closer or whatever, he might be able to become a bit more efficient, but the reality is he can't go any faster than what he's already going. With the PlayStation 4, it's a simple case of it needs more memory bandwidth because the GPU performance is slightly higher. Now, as I said, that's not an exact analogy. It's not like the PS4's GPU is like twice the speed of the Xbox One's or anything like that. But I'm just trying to give you guys a reasonable visual idea in your head that you can kind of work with there. So hopefully that helps. Just to clarify of the GPU difference, it's roughly 1.84 teraflops of computing power versus 1.32. So yeah, just so you guys know. Anyway, I think what is going to happen is that games developers are going to really need to start to understand the Xbox One. I think it's going to be a case of them needing to spend a lot more time doing optimization passes on the Xbox One's memory to really get the most out of it. They can do things, for example, like storing and do texturing from DDR3. That's completely possible. Obviously, there is there is a limitation on how much memory there are. Now, I just want to also add that for the PS4, you've not got this situation where there's unlimited memory bandwidth either. You still have to be pretty frugal, pretty smart with what you're doing with the memory bandwidth, because sure, you've got more memory bandwidth to play with, it's just that at the same time you require more memory bandwidth to feed the beast, if you will. The difference with the Xbox One and the PS4 memory bandwidth, however, isn't necessarily the amount available, it's the fact that you don't have to worry so much about the management of that memory bandwidth because it's all created equally. Anyway, I'm hoping that's answered the questions a couple of viewers have had for me, but I think that's just about it in this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.